Chapter 18. Nancy Takes Charge. "Quick! We must follow closely behind him," Nancy cried, stooping to pick up the bundle Semet had hurled at Mr. Hill. "What are you going to do? Call the police?" "No, but I shall call up my father and report to him," Nancy said. "I don't want Semet to cut any telephone wires or to injure my car." Mr. Hill took the bundle from Nancy, and the three trailed Semet across the meadow to the twisted candles. "Now, if you will keep Mr. and Mrs. Semet in sight, Mr. Hill," Nancy said, "I will telephone to Dad and tell him what has happened." "Aye, aye, mademoiselle." Mr. Hill laughed, executing a snappy salute. He followed Frank Semet into the kitchen, and Nancy soon heard the excited tones of the innkeeper and his wife raised in argument with the banker. She ran to the telephone and called her home. Hannah answered, and to Nancy's consternation reported that Mr. Drew had left for a neighboring state in connection with the Sydney will case and would not be back until the next afternoon. "I'll have to stick it out then," Nancy told herself grimly. She returned to Sadie's room and asked that young woman to please summon Mr. Hill. When that rather disheveled person appeared, Nancy explained that her father was beyond reach for the time being. "I don't doubt that Semet has taken other valuables and secreted them around the place," she said. "I am also afraid that he is now enraged against Sadie, and it is dangerous for her to stay here. Will you take her to your home or to mine, Mr. Hill? I will stay here on guard." Raymond Hill whistled. "Oh, I shouldn't think of such a thing," he declared. "I am sure that man Semet and his wife are capable of going to any extremes for money. I think you and Sadie ought to go home together." "I can't do that," Nancy said. "I promised my father I would stay here and watch the place. If none of us remains, the Semets might strip the house of all its valuables and clear out." "Better that than to suffer physical injury," Mr. Hill advised. "No, I shall stay here," Nancy said firmly. "I shall remain with you," Sadie declared. "That leaves me no choice," the banker smiled. "I, too, shall remain all night." Nancy reflected soberly for a moment. "Mr. Hill, would you be willing to take the robes from my machine and camp out in the deserted farmhouse for the night to prevent Semet from taking away any of the valuables he has hidden there?" "Willing? I jump at the opportunity," Mr. Hill cried. "I always did say I was cut out to be a detective or a member of the Northwest Mounted Police. Banking is not an exciting profession." He sighed. "Sadie and I will stay here and keep as wide awake as we can," Nancy continued. "We'll see that Asa Sidney's room is not unsealed and rifled." It was quite dark now, and Nancy coolly summoned Mrs. Semet and ordered food. "Mr. Hill is leaving immediately after he has some supper," she said. "So please let us have something to eat. A cold supper will do, as soon as you can." "Very well, miss," said the woman stiffly, and left the room. The two girls and Mr. Hill chatted about the excitement of the afternoon in a general way, not caring to be caught in any plans by the eavesdropping Semets. Minute after minute passed, a quarter of an hour, then a full half-hour. "It is taking them a dreadfully long time to prepare supper," Nancy remarked. "I'll run down and see how they are getting along," Sadie said. "It is dangerous for you to go alone," Nancy declared. "I will go with you." The kitchen, however, proved to be empty, and there were no signs of supper in progress to be seen. The meaning came to Nancy in a flash. "The Semets have run off," she exclaimed. "Get Mr. Hill quickly. Bring him out to my car at once." Nancy flew out of doors to where her roadster was parked. Her worst fears were realized when she saw that both rear tires had been slashed with a sharp knife. "And I have only one spare tire," she thought, vexed with herself for permitting the Semmets to outwit her at this point in the game. Sadie and the banker appeared, and even as Nancy was telling them of the misfortune, an idea came to her. That tire cutting was done to prevent pursuit, she said. Or else it was done to make us believe pursuit is necessary. I'll wager that the Semmets are not far off. Sadie ran to the corner of the house and immediately came back to report that the Semmet car was gone. They took nothing from the house unless it was secreted somewhere in the kitchen or basement, Nancy said. What was in the boxes at the old farmhouse, Mr. Hill, besides the bonds? A large chest of silverware, sterling, and a box of most beautiful table linens, Mr. Hill replied. I am sure the building is filled with loot. Then that's where the Semmets would go first, Nancy said with conviction. She jumped into her car and took a portable spotlight from the tool compartment. Now let's hurry to the farmhouse, Nancy said. We'll leave the lights on my car burning and a few in the house to make it look as if the place was not deserted. Nancy's remarkable sense of direction served her well as she strode off through the uplands and meadows to the old cottage. She was somewhat disappointed to find it in utter darkness. They got here ahead of us, Mr. Hill said. If they came here at all. Wait a minute, Nancy said. If they parked their car somewhere along the road, it must have taken them as long, if not longer, to reach here as it took us. The three stood in utter silence close to the trunk of a towering sycamore tree, a spot chosen by Nancy because she said the girls' airy dresses would merge with the light, mottled background of the trees in the darkness. At last, there came to Nancy's sharp ears a tiny sound that was at variance with the noises of myriads of insects and breezes and small animals. It was a metallic sound, muffled and distant. Instantly, she switched on her powerful flashlight, and the 300-foot beam cut through the blackness like a silver sword. The tumble-down farmhouse sprang into view, and on the rickety front steps, Frank and Emma Semmet were etched sharply in the glare. Call to them that the house is guarded, and that they must leave at once, Nancy whispered to Mr. Hill. Try to make your voice extra deep. Raymond Hill chuckled, cleared his throat, and then, in a resounding voice, shouted the warning Nancy had dictated. Who are you, anyhow? Semmet yelled back. I got a right to be here. Stand where you are, he continued, but Semmet only gave an ugly laugh in response and moved a step higher. If we could frighten them, whispered Nancy, with a loud noise such as... yes. Nancy picked up a smooth stone. I wonder... Mr. Hill quickly sensed her idea, grabbed the rock, and with a straight fling he sent it forward at a swift pace. There was the crash of splintered glass, and Semmet leaped off the steps into the darkness as the fan light over the front door shattered into splinters, just as Nancy had hoped. Mrs. Semmet screamed and ran after her husband. Inexorably, Nancy kept the spotlight upon the panic-stricken pair as they charged through the brush and meadow grass toward the road. I guess they won't be back, Mr. Hill said with a laugh. But just to be on the safe side, I'll camp out here. Nancy left the flashlight with the adventurous banker and returned to the house with Sadie, who was on the verge of hysterics as a result of the fateful day. From a drudging life in a roadside inn, she had come into one of wealth and envy and had participated in a manhunt, all in a few hours. Nancy switched the lights off her car and then entered the house. She directed Sadie to bolt all the windows, and as extra precaution, she piled furniture against the doors. No burglar alarms, I suppose, Nancy observed. We'll have to invent some. From the sideboard, she took long-stemmed goblets and balanced them on the tops of the lower window sashes so that any attempt to force the windows would send the glasses toppling to the floor with a crash. "Go on to bed, Sadie. I'll sleep here on the couch," Nancy directed. Sadie demurred at being left alone, however, and at last the girls dozed off into uneasy slumber on pillow-piled settees. Nothing happened to disturb their slumbers, and Nancy awoke, a little stiff and sadly rumpled, as the sun poured in through the windows. She found her way to the kitchen, washed her face, and rinsed her parched mouth. Through the window she saw Mr. Hill making his way toward the house. "Cheerio!" the banker hailed her. "All quiet on the battlefront last night. Any excitement?" "Not a bit," Nancy replied. Sadie appeared and ventured the opinion she could make up a breakfast of sorts. While Mr. Hill telephoned to his home and his office, Sadie made coffee, which had to be drunk black by the banker, while milkless cocoa served for the girls. Scrambled eggs and toasted stale bread completed a filling, if not satisfactory, meal. "I shall have to go to the bank," Mr. Hill said. "My chauffeur will call for me, and then I am sending him back to mount guard at the farmhouse." "We will stay here in the inn, which will not open to anyone," Nancy planned. "As soon as my father returns, I will have him see that a watchman is placed here, and I will take Sadie to my home." "An excellent plan. Certainly the best possible under the circumstances," Mr. Hill declared. "Nancy, you are a regular general. You certainly won a major battle of wits from the Semets." Nancy thanked Mr. Hill modestly, and then the banker's car arrived and carried him off. The two girls were left alone to hold the fort. In half an hour's time, the chauffeur was back again with new tires for Nancy's car, which he deftly mounted and pumped up before taking up his guard duty at the farmhouse. Toward noon, Nancy called her home and learned that her father had just arrived half a minute before. She swiftly outlined the events of the preceding day to him, and he promised that precautions such as Nancy suggested would be promptly taken. And indeed, within the hour, an automobile drove up with Mr. Drew in it, besides two powerfully built men who walked as stealthily as cats. "Private detectives," Mr. Drew said briefly. He posted the men, one in the house and one at the farmhouse, to relieve the banker's chauffeur. At midnight, they were to be relieved by another sentry. "Now then, Sadie, pack your things and we'll speed home to a bracing bath and some real food," Nancy laughed happily. "Our worries are over for the time being." There Nancy made a mistake. Not until she was home did Mr. Drew tell her that the Sidney Boonton families had engaged Walker Cochran, a lawyer whose reputation was almost as great as his own, to fight Sadie's claim to Asa Sidney's fortune. "That's a contest where I can't help you, can I?" Nancy asked. "I wish I were old enough to be a lawyer." "You have done the work of a dozen men already," Mr. Drew said earnestly, "and I am sure we shall win the lawsuit. It would help very much if we had some supportable testimony as to why Mr. Sidney favored this orphan girl above his entire family." "It is not really his family, Dad," Nancy said. "Mr. Sidney's children left no descendants. The Boontons and the Sidneys are just branches of the family." "Even so, they would be the heirs at law if he had not made a will," Mr. Drew replied. Nancy secretly resolved that she would search for supporting evidence to the will to convince the jury that Sadie had genuinely earned the old man's gratitude. "The Semets, I learn, have joined the others to break the will," Mr. Drew went on. "They may give dangerous testimony if they think it's worth their while against Sadie." "They are just trying to cover their guilty tracks," Nancy said hotly. "You will certainly be able to batter down their stories." I hope so, Mr. Drew said. Thoughtfully, Nancy returned to the guest room to help Sadie unpack. That pathetically small job had already been accomplished by the new heiress. She had only 3 dresses, 2 of them serviceable black frocks to be worn while waiting on tables, and 1 a cheap flowered organdy, the same one she had worn to the house. Her small stock of undies and stockings did not half fill 1 bureau drawer, and the only shoes she had were the ones on her feet. "Let's go downtown and have a shopping orgy," Nancy cried. "I have charge accounts, and you can pay me back when you receive your inheritance, Sadie. We'll buy some frocks and socks and slippers and silk underthings and pajamas." "Oh, may I do all that?" Sadie gasped. "It will be the biggest thrill of my life." "It'll be such fun for me," Nancy laughed. "Let's go at once." Fun. As Nancy led Sadie into the elevator of a big department store, she discovered that Bess and George were the only other occupants. End of chapter 18.